Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Jane, and I'm a senior at McAllister College. This presentation is about the work that I've been doing this year on my senior honors thesis, which is titled Wild and Semi-Wild Plant Consumption and Nutrition Among Women Farmers in Southwestern Burkina Faso. So this paper uses data from a multi-year project studying nutrition and food insecurity in Burkina Faso. So today I'm just going to present a few important aspects of the larger project that I've been working on. In 2020, 1 in 9 people globally were undernourished, and 1 in 3 people were obese or overweight. Within countries, access to food is deeply connected to social, economic, and political structures. Our current food system prioritizes input-intensive production, assuming that by growing more, hunger will decrease. But this practice undervalues alternative methods for getting nutrients, like foraging and consuming wild plants, which are still important around the world. Alongside this shift in agriculture, there's a global trend that as countries become wealthier and more urbanized, nutrition declines and the prevalence of non-communicable diseases increases. One measure that can be used to assess nutrition is dietary diversity, which is the number of different food groups consumed over 24 hours, and it's a proxy for the economic ability of a household to incorporate a variety of foods into the diet. Increased dietary diversity tends to coincide with higher socioeconomic status and food security, and a consistently diverse diet is less vulnerable to changes in accessibility to certain foods. So today in my presentation, I'm going to outline my 3 research questions, give an overview of the literature relevant to my project, discuss my methods and results, and then go over some conclusions and next steps. My paper is focused on answering 3 research questions. The first, is there a relationship between wild and semi-wild plant consumption and wealth? And if so, how can this relationship be explained? The second, is there a relationship between wild and semi-wild plant consumption and dietary diversity? And the third, how does seasonality impact the consumption of wild and semi-wild plants for nutrition? Because of the time limitations for this presentation, I only focus on the first 2 research questions. In my paper, I examined 3 main conversations in the literature: foraging, improving rural nutrition, and gender power dynamics. I focus on plants that are indigenous to Burkina Faso, whether they're occurring in the wild, tended in the wild, or planted and taken care of by people. And I use the terms wild and semi-wild to describe these. In Burkina Faso, trees like the African baobab and African locust bean provide necessary nutrients and tend to be more adapted to harsh environmental conditions than cultivated crops. For improving rural nutrition, the mainstream perspective is that input-intensive farming increases yields, income, and therefore nutrition. I examine this by bringing in ideas of household gender relations and agrobiodiversity. I also discuss the nutrition transition, which is represented by an increase in processed foods and non-communicable diseases, which happens as countries become more urbanized and more developed. Lastly, for gender power dynamics, I explore the idea that women have a higher responsibility to informal activities and also less access to land and labor, so this causes a gender gap in production. Now I'm going to give a little bit of background information on agriculture in Burkina Faso and the study villages. Burkina Faso is a landlocked country in the Sahel region of West Africa. 80% of the population is engaged in subsistence farming, and agriculture here relies on the highly irregular rainfall patterns, which makes people vulnerable to food insecurity. Data for this research were collected in 5 villages in southwestern Burkina Faso, surrounding the country's second largest city of Bobo-Dioulasso, as you can see here in this map. 3 of them are part of an improved rice commercialization project, and the other 2 are not. The main crops grown and consumed in the southwest are rice, maize, millet, and sorghum. The rainy season is from May through October, but the growing season only goes through July. In the middle of the rainy season is the hungry season from June through August, which is shown in red here in the graphic. This is when people are waiting for the harvest and the food stores are running low. And then the harvest is between October and December, and this is during the dry season. The research team conducted semi-structured interviews over 4 years from 2016 to 2020, 2 in the rainy season and 2 in the dry season. The research team is Professor Bill Mosley from Macalester College, a few former Macalester students, and several Burkina Faso research assistants. There are 131 participants who can be found across all rounds of data, and all of the participants are women. In 2016, the research team did baseline surveys and calculated household wealth, so I used three groups to measure wealth: poor, average, and wealthy. In all rounds of data collection, participants reported all foods eaten by the household in the past 24 hours, and the listed foods were categorized into the 16 food groups in the Household Dietary Diversity Score created by the Food and Agricultural Organization, which is shown in this picture. The survey showed that many people were eating plants like African baobab, African locust bean, and shea. So this led me to focus my project specifically on wild plants. To measure wild plants in the diet, I created a new dietary diversity score called Alternative Dietary Diversity, or ADDS. And I made this score because wild and semi-wild foods found in the surveys fall into 7 of the 16 Household Dietary Diversity Score categories: 2 categories of fruits, 2 categories of vegetables, oils and fats, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and other. So I used the score to determine whether participants were actually filling these categories with wild foods or with cultivated plants. And this new score has a strong positive correlation to household dietary diversity, which makes it an appropriate measure for diversity among wild plants. I use a feminist political ecology framework to analyze my results. According to this framework, gender is socially constructed, but it has real impacts on human-environment interactions. This makes it really useful for studying rural nutrition, agriculture, and the gender division of labor. I also draw from other subfields of political ecology. In particular, I use ideas from scholars studying the intersections between health, nutrition, agriculture, and gender. My first research question asks about the relationship between wild plant consumption and wealth. I answered my research questions at 3 scales, but today I'm just going to talk about the broadest. For this scale, I aggregated all participants' responses over the 4 study seasons and compared different measures of dietary diversity between the wealth groups. You can see in chart 1 that wealthy households have a higher household dietary diversity and alternative dietary diversity than poor households. On the other hand, poor households ate a higher diversity of wild foods than wealthy households did. I also looked at the percent of alternative dietary diversity filled by wild foods for each wealth group to show the importance of wild foods for getting those fruits, vegetables, legumes, and fats into the diet. You can see in chart 2 that this percentage was higher for poor households than for wealthy households. And all of these differences between the wealth groups in both charts are statistically significant at the 5% level. Chart 2 shows that participants had a pretty high proportion of their alternative dietary diversity filled by wild foods, regardless of wealth. In fact, the average across all wealth groups was 65%. Overall, the results from this question indicate that wealth does matter for wild plant consumption among participants because wild foods were more important for poor households in getting diversity into the diet. These findings also confirm that the degenerative health pattern of the nutrition transition is not occurring in the study villages because wealth is still leading to better nutrition. This shows that wealth can improve nutrition, but only before broader economic and social changes create a negative shift. Now moving on to my second research question about dietary diversity. At the aggregate level, I found a positive correlation between the diversity of wild foods and alternative dietary diversity. Although the correlation is pretty weak, the results suggest that wild and semi-wild foods are important for increasing the diversity of fruits, vegetables, legumes, and fats, because when people scored high in the categories that wild foods can fit into, they tended to eat a higher diversity of wild foods. You can also see in this graph the proportion of the alternative dietary diversity filled by wild foods, which I discussed in the last research question. So for the lowest point on the graph circled in red, they had a score of 1 for the diversity of wild foods and a 1.5 for their average alternative dietary diversity, which is about 66%, and this is about the average for all of the participants. The last piece of results I'll talk about today is the correlation between household dietary diversity and the percent of alternative dietary diversity filled by wild foods. At the aggregate level, I found a moderate negative correlation as shown in the graph. This indicates that as people get more diversity in their overall diet, they use fewer wild foods to obtain fruits, vegetables, legumes, and fats. Given that there's a strong positive correlation between household dietary diversity and alternative dietary diversity, this means that people are getting more fruits and vegetables into their overall diet as household dietary diversity increases, but they're using a wider variety of cultivated foods to obtain this diversity. This also means that wild foods are the most important for households with a low dietary diversity, which in my first research question I found are poorer households. For example, in the household with the lowest dietary diversity circled in red on the graph, wild foods were their only source of fruits, vegetables, legumes, and fats. These results are consistent when the 4 study seasons were separated, and the general trend is also present within each of the 5 study villages. Overall, I found that wild foods were important for participants in getting dietary diversity. An average of 65% of all fruits, vegetables, legumes, and fats came from wild foods. I also found that at this point, wealth is still leading to better nutrition because wealthier households had a higher household dietary diversity than poorer households. However, these wealthier households also had a lower percent of wild foods in their fruits and vegetables, suggesting that they're prioritizing other foods when they're able to. This is consistent with the literature because other scholars have found that foraged foods are often replaced with cultivated crops when resources allow, because they're seen as higher status foods than foraged foods. So, why does this matter? The current path in international development is to increase cash crop production. But if this is undermining the availability of wild foods, this could have negative effects on nutrition and dietary diversity, and would especially impact poor households who tend to rely more on wild and semi-wild foods to obtain fruits and vegetables. Based on these results, I suggest that projects for agricultural commercialization consider wild and semi-wild plants. Some of the most important species grow on traditional agroforestry systems, which are being transformed by input-intensive monocropping. Prioritizing traditionally foraged foods and rural diets by governments and development organizations can help retain agrobiodiversity, slow the nutrition transition, and improve dietary diversity. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for listening.